Dystopia warning, obviously. I know, nobody's interested in the Tory leadership contest. Why would I want to watch a bunch of psychopaths, rejects from the Raggy Dolls factory of doom, falling all over each other to lead a party that's going to be in opposition for the next 5 years? Well, you might want to pay attention when I tell you my theory, which is that all this is just the Conservatives making plans for Nigel. And not just making plans for Nigel to return to the Conservative Party, but plans in the next number of years to make him leader of the opposition and then the contender in the next general election. This is just my opinion, but I've not plucked it out of thin air. Now, I've been telling you for the last number of weeks, those that are still interested and still want to listen to me ramble nonsense about politics constantly, that I think that Robert Jenrick is going to be the next leader of the opposition. Now, it's an absolute certainty. And I never thought I'd say this, but James Cleverly was our last hope of sense. I know, what the actual... But if this turns out to be true, that his team blundered by lending votes to Jenrick, thus knocking Cleverly out of the race, then it will prove that Cleverly is one of the most ironically named men ever. Some particularly mad facets of the right-wing media were saying that if Cleverly wins, they're off to reform, when the Conservative Party in its current degraded, unrecognisable form is reform. That moron was our last shot at sense. A better choice from the wasteland of Tory candidates, which is admittedly a little bit like choosing your favourite flavour of shit, frankly. But he represented moderation, kind of Cameron-esque, return to the kind of one nation Tory. Dim, self-serving, but not dangerous. This was the Conservative Party's last shot at saving itself. An opportunity for them to learn from their battering at the general election. A step back into the direction of Soubry, Greaves, Major. But no, of course, the Tory MPs decided instead they wanted a continuation of the blue kip, MAGA, Farage 2.0 madness, despite Stop the Boats being chanted as a slogan by people trying to burn down asylum seeker hotels just a couple of months ago. They want a continuation of decline and chaos for the dark money that funds them. So now we're left with bad Enoch and Jenrick. Jenrick will be the next leader of the Conservative Party, and that's for two very simple reasons. One, those who are still, despite everything, members of the Conservative Party are reform in everything but name. And they're going to pick the white candidate because they're racist. And you get people going, oh, but the Tories, they've had female leaders and they've had a person of colour as a leader. Little correction there. They chose Mad Truss over Sunak. Sunak was inherited, not put in post by members. And every single female Prime Minister that they've had, they've ousted. Truss, after just a month, although admittedly, I don't often defend them, she was mental, so they had to. You've currently got a lot of people going around at the moment saying that either of these two, as the leader of the opposition, is a gift that Labour won't have to declare. But that is bollocks, and I'll tell you why. It's actually the absolute opposite of that. And also, it's not about what's just good for Labour, it's about what's good for the country as a whole. And either of them, and it's going to be Jenrick, being the leader of the opposition, is a terrible thing for democracy. In case you hadn't noticed, Reform got a shockingly large number of votes at the general election. A whopping 70% of Conservatives want a closer relationship with Reform, which ties me back to saying the members are essentially Reform now. Can I just point out how ironic it is that there's a think tank associated with Liz Truss? Remarkable, considering she can't think. Despite his hypocrisy, despite the fact that he's running an obvious con, all the scandals around his gifts that are not reported, and the countless questions that he has to answer about his links to Russia, his popularity isn't waning. Because he's cashed in on the Tories not just debasing politics, but creating decline. And I don't just mean monetarily, I mean emotionally, mentally, in terms of critical thinking in this country. The raging sex yeti, Johnson, being instated as Prime Minister was the moment that we realised that populism had made people completely lose their minds. They knew what he was, but they did it anyway. They'll know what he is, and they'll do it anyway. And Cameron offering a referendum on leaving the European Union was the moment when you realise the lengths that they will go to, the Conservatives, to retain power. They'll let the entire country burn, as long as they're the ones that are inside number 10, as the touch paper is lit. And that's why Robert Jenrick, also known as Honest Bob, previously known as Robert Jenrick, and now playing the role of a dangerous authoritarian fascist, is doing all he can to out-reform reform. Know what you're thinking? Why does our fascist look like a giant baby? And I honestly don't have the answer to that question. But he does, doesn't he? He's going to be more Farage than Farage. And they'll continue to shift the Overton window from opposition. And this is why it's bad for Labour and democracy. Because the dark money, the foreign interference will continue. There'll be more radicalisation from autocrats that benefit from undermining our country and creating chaos and division. Because this lot are the people that get in bed with them all the time, pretending that they're true patriots while shagging a flag dry. There'll be a massive uptick in the far right. More bot farms, more culture wars, more hatred, and more help and support from the position of opposition by their mates in the media. They will dominate the conversation from the outside, as they have been since Labour took power. And that's a big part of why Starmer's approval ratings are so low. The same papers are going, oh, look at the terrible approval ratings, whilst they've been basically making out that Starmer is worse than Johnson. All day, every day, for weeks. I mean, these two have been saying insane stuff for a while. I mean, Badenoch is cashing in on Braverman's multiculturalism has failed line, which Braverman got from the MAGA right. She said this the other week, something that's overtly National Front. Did the media call it out as dangerous, divisive? No, they had phone-ins asking whether or not it's true that some cultures are less valid. And this is how far-right talking points get in the mainstream, are legitimised. It's the whole just asking questions thing, isn't it? Now, people are saying that this is all a way for them to set up the return of Johnson. That's not happening. Johnson's mask slipped ages ago. Now he's just like a dejected clown, makeup running, circling the perimeter of the circus, begging for scraps. He's the joke that's no longer funny. This is all about making plans for Nigel. And Nigel only wants what's best for him. Time and time again, Tories have failed to rule out him returning. He's had his eye on the big job for ages, which is why electing him in any capacity was a fucking insane thing to do. That's why he turned his attention on conning a run-down seaside town in Essex. He will defect, and they'll allow it because power at any cost, right? Then he will stand at the next general election, I'm calling it, whilst hoping desperately that I'm wrong. Now, if Trump loses and sanity prevails in the US, this could provide a window of hope. Another thing that would help enormously would be Keir Starmer having the balls to take on the media. But with headlines like this, and people saying that the Sun and the Sunday Times got on board with Labour prior to the election, although I didn't see any real evidence of that. And that's why he's not implementing Leveson 2. Matt Hancock scrapped Leveson 2 in 2018. My opinion on this is broadly down to my disdain of inquiries generally. I don't see them as being any use to us. They're very expensive. We have to pay for them. And I think they're just there to run down the clock of public outrage with bureaucracy. Hyper-focusing on the minutiae, the ultimate outcome being avoidance of accountability for the powerful. Rarely leads to criminal convictions, at least not in any timely manner. It's a way for people that should be in prison to avoid prison. That's my view on inquiries. We don't need recommendations that a government has no obligation to implement. We need legislation. We need laws. We need consequences for people that break those laws. We need wholesale press reform. They're supposed to be there to legislate, and it's not just in their interests that they do. The new Labour government needs to learn something very important, and they need to learn it very quickly. Nothing they do to try and appease the press will work, besides handing the keys to number 10 to a Tory or Farage, who are at this point indistinguishable from each other. The problem is that they're there in the first place. And if they don't take control of the billionaires running these organisations, then those billionaires sunning themselves in the Bahamas are going to continue to be the people that are really in control of our country. Because presently they're not just above the law, they're above the governments. I'm not saying this because I want a dictatorship in which only positive headlines are put forward about the Labour government or any particular party. I'm saying it because truth matters. And we're not getting truth from our press. We're getting a narrative. We're getting spin. We're getting bias. We're getting corruption. We're getting preferential treatment. And we're getting misinformation. We need a Prime Minister with the courage and the conviction to stand up to them. And are we seeing at the moment? Absolutely not. All I'm seeing is appeasement of the scumbags. And they're just getting a battering for it anyway. So stick the boot in. Because the thing that's making me most angry about the last couple of months and the way that they're trying to create this false equivalence between Labour and the Tories is that it's letting the Tories off the hook for what they've done to this country for the last 14 years. The Conservative Party's allowed to casually stroll away from the scene of the crime and to add insult to significant injury. They have the fucking cheek to point the finger at the clean-up operation, which is only underway because they shat over everything, which people just seem to not care about. That's the legacy of the last 14 years of the Conservatives. Debasing politics, standards in public life, flooding the zone with so many scandals that people just don't care. Because they can just rewrite history with their mates at the Mail and the Sun and the Telegraph and the Times and the Express and the Standard, because this is how it works. It's like the last 14 years didn't happen. We've literally got people at MI6 and MI5 warning us that there's untold Russian interference, which we'd probably know more about in terms of Tory collusion if they'd actually released the unredacted Russia report. That's the problem with reports and inquiries, we don't get the full picture. What we just need are for governments to take action. Not for the sake of them winning an election, but for the sake of our democracy, so that facts don't cease to matter. And my hyper-focus on the Tories and reform is because they're the bigger picture, they're the threat looming over the hill. Labour are currently getting on with the work of government, and I'm going to give them a little bit longer to sort their shit out, which they really have to. They have to deliver, they have to make people feel better. But they can't do that without getting a grip on the press, without stopping foreign interference in our politics. Because if they fail, the far right will sweep in, undo their progress and start filling their pockets. When it's not really that difficult for the new government, just give us what we want. But I have to say, them having a mad opposition is not going to help matters. You've got people so radicalised that they'll happily just surrender their rights if it means they get the illegals deported. That's precisely what these psychopaths have been working towards for years. Step 1, make people hate foreigners. Step 2, leave the EU. We lose our rights. They gain loads of power and money and status. Next stop, take away people's human rights. Many people in this country won't even know what the ECHR does or what it is, but they do. They know precisely how they'd exploit us leaving. So do the autocrats, pulling the strings of people like this. And they're the last people you want to surrender your rights to. If it does come down to it, and there is a referendum, it will be too late for people to regret that one. The fact that so many people can't see it is infuriating. It's happening all over Europe, and most of them have links to Putin. So the area in which Starmer really needs to up his game, and up his game fast, is in terms of standing up to the press. Because greasing his arse and bending over the barrel isn't going to help him. Or us. Because that's how you get Prime Minister Farage. And that's precisely what I think the Conservatives are aiming for. And that's why it's important to keep an eye on them. They're doubling down. And the only people that are going to benefit from that are the populist con men. Nice one, dickheads.